Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Meyerstein lecture. So today we have Naomi Sykes giving our talk, and I think Naomi is familiar to many of you in the department already. I think both through sort of research collaborations, and I guess a lot of the research that people do in the department is related to things Naomi does anyway. So I'm sure you've all seen her in other places. So in her career, Naomi's undertaken a very broad range of archaeological research spanning lots of periods and different regions. But I think the one thing which has, I guess, been the main focus for a lot of her research has been the kind of thing she started doing as a doctoral student in Southampton, which was on which she did a thesis on zooarchaeological perspectives of Norman conquest, which I guess shows she was going to be into medieval archaeology as well as earlier archaeology. And I think with everything she's done since, she's maintained that focus, I guess, on human-animal environment interactions. Otherwise, I think the geographical range and the period range would be too much for anyone to manage to cope with. So her research, I think, has demonstrated to all of us just how much we can learn from analysis of animals in the archaeological and environmental records. And in order to answer the kind of questions that she wants to answer, because she's not a methods person, I think it's more a matter of answering sort of archaeological questions. I think she's been notably successful in pulling together information from a lot of different techniques, from archaeozoology, DNA, isotope studies, and that kind of thing. And so I think many of you will know have a book, Beastly Questions, Animal Answers to Archaeological Issues, which I think within the field, I think was something which for a lot of people set the scene, and a lot of the themes that are central to the subject and indeed her own research. So she's now based at the University of Exeter, where she's both the Lawrence Professor of Archaeology and also the head of department for history and archaeology. So a huge number of things to do at the same time. So we're very pleased she's managed to make a little bit of time to come over here to Oxford today. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Naomi to deliver the annual Meyerstein lecture today. Under, I think, the characteristically, titles are always neat, you know, dead important, addressing the archaeological curation crisis. So welcome to you, Naomi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you all. Thank you, Chris, for that very warm welcome. And also thank you to Robin, who I know has been working behind the scenes to organise this, and I think has run off to go and sort out the wine, I think, which is good. Okay, so I'm going to start by through this talk, I'm going to tell you lots of different stories, and I'm probably going to ask you to juggle quite a few storylines and plot points in your head, but I'll try and pull it all back together, right? So I'm going to tell you lots of different stories. We'll probably go on a couple of side quests as well through this lecture, but the overarching thing and the overarching narrative that I want us to talk about is the archaeological curation crisis, because we don't have enough crises in our lives right now, right? That we need a discipline-specific one too. I don't know how many of you have heard of the curation crisis. It's not something that I had really thought about or heard about. I was aware that I was finding it more difficult to get access to samples than back when I was doing my PhD, but didn't really know of the curation crisis until I started hanging out with this guy, Barney Sloan. I'm sure a lot of you know him. He's the National Specialist Service Director for Historic England. And back in 2017, he started going like, hey, archaeologists, just to let you know, the museum stores, about a third of them, 2/3 of them are already at capacity. And we all kind of went, yeah, thanks, Barney, and just got on with our conversations. Ever since then, he's been leading a cross-sector group to try and get us to listen and to try and get the government to listen. And now he's saying, you've got until 27 to 28, and then there's no more space, right? All the archaeological stores are out of space. He now has my attention, right? This is terrifying. And it's not just the idea that archives and storage space is running out. It's also the people to facilitate access to those collections and provide students, researchers, others with access to materials. So, you know, my whole career has been based on accessing archives and doing the kinds of work that Chris mentioned, but it's not just me, it's everyone. I just took some screen captures from your website and the kind of press releases that you've got. And it's like, Gregor, do you really think you're churning out loads of science and nature papers if you can't get access to archaeological samples? Probably not, right? And are we able to tell stories about cannibalism in the Bronze Age? And can we go and get like shells to help us with our radiocarbon dating protocols if we can't get access to archives and that material isn't around? Now, you would think that this is a really easy slam dunk argument to make to government when you're in search of funding to ensure that there are going to be more collections available. But that's not really the case. Like, government right now, when we have so many crises, is not going to care that much that we can assert that archaeological archives are super, super important, because once we recently discovered that 2000 years ago, chickens had less yellow legs than we thought they might, right? You know, this is not a narrative that is going to generate a huge amount of, I know, I'm sorry. You may be finding that I'm throwing you under the bus quite a lot in this talk. So what we need are narratives that government are going to care about. They want to know that archaeology and archives can contribute to modern day society, economics, nature renewal, and all of these sorts of things. The biodiversity crisis, they want to know. And, you know, we get there. I mean, if we just go back, you've got some papers there about cats, something about viruses. You know, some of these things sound as though they're relevant, but we're not really presenting a coherent narrative to the people who have the cash that what we do really, really matters. And I've been thinking about this and looking around, trying to think there must be loads of people who are addressing modern day challenges through curation-based research. And there are a couple of people. So I don't know if Anwen's in the audience, but she's based in Oxford. She's using curate. There she is. You know, you're using the archives to actually address things like nature renewal. And Philippa Ryan, now very, very busy at Kew because she's doing all the amazing work using archaeological data to address food security and other kinds of crop histories and all of those sorts of things. But I can't think of that many others. And I'm in the right place to ask. If you've got examples, let me know, because we need to start collating this so that we can give it to Barney so that he can go and make the case to others that it's worth investing in the kind of research that we do, because it's useful for today, not because it's like just a nice story. And I'm not saying that that's all we provide, obviously. I think there's also a crisis in terms of what happens, you know, in order to get these really important stories. A lot of the analysis that we do is pretty destructive. So again, I just went onto the internet and you can find just images and images of people grinding up bones and, you know, but do we share the data? Do we, you know, often no, we just like go grab some samples, hide them, never let anyone have access to them so that we can rush out on nature papers before somebody else, right? So there's a lot of competition that we destroy a lot of what is quite precious biocultural heritage without necessarily sharing the results. So that's part of the crisis as well, because it is finite to a certain extent. So what I'm going to do in this talk then is show through some of the work that I've been doing, and this is a particular project. It was one of the first ones that I did called Dharma International. If you are a Eurovision fan, you will realize that's very, very funny. If you're not, you don't know what I'm talking about, but look it up. So Dharma International, it was trying to understand everything about fallow deer. This is the species of deer that if you go to a stately home, they're the ones that are looking pretty on the lawn. I was really interested in how this species kind of got around the world. And as Chris says, brought together lots of different methods, some archaeological science, but also material culture, iconography, lots and lots of people, some sociology as well, to explore this story of the fallow deer. With initially just the same as we all do, what stories can we find out about the past without thinking how can it be relevant to the present? But that comes, and I'll talk more about that. But this is the main focus of the paper, as I said, with a few side quests. So first of all, then, the fallow deer. There are two species of fallow deer. You've got the Mesopotamian fallow deer, which is this one that I'm kind of characterizing in purple, which its native range is kind of perceived to be Iran, Iraq, all of that area there. The European fallow deer is thought to have been native to Turkey, right? So we've got two different species. And very restricted range. The Persian fallow deer is, according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is labelled as endangered. It's functionally extinct, right? The only ones that you've got are really in zoos. The European fallow deer is considered endangered. The last native population is held within a park in Termessos. There are about 200 individuals. So that's an endangered species. They're both on the red list. And that protection from the red list actually goes to the population that's on the island of Rhodes. So if you've ever been to Rhodes, you'll see there's a huge amount of fallow deer iconography all over the place, because it's perceived that they were taken there early in the Neolithic, and therefore they are also protected, not only by the IUCN, but also by Greek law. Today, they've gone around the world, right? So they are South Africa, South America, they're in New Zealand and Australia, and even they're the national animal of Barbuda in the Caribbean, right? So this is, I didn't know this before I started the project. And because they've gone everywhere, outside of Termessos in Turkey, they are considered least concern, right? They've been translocated, so they're everywhere. Their populations are huge. We don't need to worry about them. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about this kind of IUCN labeling of their conservation status, because you might be able to tell already that there's a bit of a narrative when it comes to the way the IUCN and all conservation really thinks about animals. So if we think about this more generally, and I've done a lot of projects looking into these kinds of issues, there is a kind of belief that anything that is native or is wild or is endangered is good, right? That's the stuff that we're trying to preserve. Anything that is bad are stuff that is translocated, domestic, feral. That's bad, because then you might become invasive, which is like terrible. But if you're in the middle, if you're you can be a heritage animal, a bit like the Rhodes deer, right? They've been translocated, but it happened a long time ago. So it happened in the past. So it's kind of good. So a heritage animal can be good. And if you can be extinct, that's even better, right? It's a bit like nobody appreciates an artist until they're dead. The same is true with animals. I mean, what's that company, Colossal? There you go. That's all you need to know, right? Everybody loves extinct animals. So I just want you to keep this in mind, because it's important for where I'm trying to take some of this stuff. Okay. So we had this big project then looking at fallow deer and their distribution, because I wanted to know just like, how have they gone global? When did they go global? And why did they go global? And all of these are really interesting to me. And as soon as we started, what I'm going to show is kind of a combination of all of the results that we've got. So these maps show archaeology, they show zoo archaeological representation. It's been color coded by our genetics results. So you can see that in the case of the Persian fallow deer, actually their distribution heads a little bit further to the west than we thought. That there's also this Anatolian population, which are going to be yellow throughout, pretty well represented. But actually, in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, there's a huge ton of fallow deer that are also in the Balkans. No one knew that they were ever there, but that's where the densest population of fallow deer is. So there's another area where fallow deer were once native, but not today. And very, very early on, all of these species of deer, but particularly the Persian and the red Balkan ones, are being hopped onto islands. So they're being translocated. So the question is why? I mean, I guess people are moving lots of other animals around at this point. And I would say that maybe the fallow deer are just another part of that package of animals of cattle, sheep, pig that are being moved around in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. But I think it's more than that. I think it's not just that these animals are being moved around just for, I don't know, food is what people would normally think. I think it's very much linked into religion. We see that in the areas where we have all of those fallow deer in the Balkans, we've also got lots of material culture demonstrating how important fallow deer were. They were particularly connected to the goddess Artemis in this period in the Bronze Age. We've got even a Parthian horn with Aramaic inscriptions that actually says Artemis. It's dedicated to Artemis, and you can see all of these beautiful representations. This is work that's been done by Chris Ward. So I think as we see them moving, it is initially associated with religion, and I think that's something that we see with a lot of other animals that people wouldn't necessarily imagine are moving for religious purposes rather than for the economic reasons that people would normally think. So that association with the goddess Artemis continues into the Roman period, but now in her Roman incarnation as the goddess Diana. And we see that spread of all of these Balkan deer across Northern Europe and even into Britain in the Roman period. So that's when it's really kicking off. And just to point out, can you see here that we've got some of the purple ones? The Persian fallow deer are even making it over to Majorca in the Roman period. So they're being translocated all over the place. But the site that I really want to focus on is Fishbourne Roman Palace, which is a site that I've been working on since FBE 96, Fishbourne East 96, which was the first excavation that I was a supervisor on. And this site is phenomenal. It was excavated originally in the 1960s by Barry Cunliffe, who of course is Oxford. And what's amazing about the Fishbourne, not only the excavation, is that he had the foresight to collect animal bones at a time that no one was collecting animal bones. And Annie Grant, who worked on the animal bones, essentially created the field of zooarchaeology in this country. And then they kept all of the animal bones, which doesn't really happen, and certainly not in the 1960s, which meant that I've been able to spend my career going back to Fishbourne with every single project that I've had. And because the archive's been collected and kept, we've been able to go back and use new techniques on the material there. So what we found when we reanalyzed it, because Annie didn't initially identify fallow deer at Fishbourne, but when we did some reanalysis, we found that there were a lot of bones. But the question is always, well, does this mean that the animals were living at Fishbourne? Because of that association with the goddess Artemis and Diana, there was a lot of movement of body parts, almost like relics. So you can see here that we've got a shed antler. It's been shaved. They're kind of grinding it into powder, we think, as medicine. Here's another medical implement. You can see there's a spatula. It's a foot bone that's been traded. We find bones, bits and bobs all over the place, but it doesn't mean that those animals are actually alive in those places. But at Fishbourne, we had some mandibles, which meant that we were able to do strontium isotope analysis, which we did, and put it against a lot of background data. So we did initially a few isotope analyses and then went back and did even more. We took samples from teeth that form early in the animal's life, so the M1, slightly later in the M2 and the M3, so the animal equivalent of the wisdom teeth. This is the location of Fishbourne, this red spot here. And if the animal was born and raised at Fishbourne, all of its teeth would be plotting in this green area. And what I can show you is that early forming tooth, all of the samples that we took on that do not plot in the Fishbourne area, but all of the other teeth do. So this is an individual that was born somewhere, came to Fishbourne and lived out the rest of its life. We've then got another mandible that's dated slightly later. This one is definitely Roman, around just after the conquest, around AD 70. And we've got one that's slightly later, and all of its teeth fall within the Fishbourne area. Now, the question is then, well, strontium is good enough, but if it's yellow, it could have been a fallow deer that came from Wales. It didn't, but it could have been. So we needed to do other techniques. And Holly Miller was on the project and wanted to look at oxygen isotope analysis, which is linked into temperature. But there's no baseline for this. So she had to go off and create her own baseline by collecting samples, again, from archives of natural history collections to undertake the analyses and find out the baseline so that we had some understanding of what the results mean. So she's got lots of modern samples, lots of archaeological samples. And if the individuals come from a cold temperature, they would plot down here, more temperate in the green area and hotter up here. So again, the same mandible. What we can see is that those later forming teeth, both in the temperate area that we would expect from Fishbourne, but that early forming tooth is plotting in a hot country. So we're pretty confident now that this is a first generation import that's come from the Mediterranean somewhere, arrives at Fishbourne, a population is established, and we've got a nice story there. So I just want to focus a little bit on this mandible, right? Because we've done a lot of analysis. We've done the genetics, we've done just standard carbon, nitrogen, lots of radiocarbon dates, strontium and oxygen on all of the teeth. And that's not the only animal that we've worked on. We've also had projects looking at rabbits and hares and cats and chickens and all of these sorts of things. So I just wanted to show you that we've got some a rabbit bone, a single rabbit bone from Fishbourne, radiocarbon dated genetics. It's all very exciting. We've got cats, radiocarbon dated genetics, all very exciting. Chickens, radiocarbon dated genetics, isotopes, all very exciting. And this is what they look like now, which is just Imagine those lovely complete specimens. They now look like this. And we didn't scan any of them. That's not true. We scanned the rabbit. But back in the day when I was doing the fallow deer, no one was scanning stuff in advance. We just ground it up willy-nilly, going, there'll be plenty more. And then we had people join our project going like, oh, I've come to do the GMM on all of your stuff. And I'm like, we've got loads of mandibles and everything you need. And then we would hand over these crumbs and they're like, yeah, I can't use this for anything. It's like, it's okay. We've got all of the astragali because you need those too, right? And they're like, yeah, that would be great. And we hand them over. They've all been just like cut straight through because no one was thinking about what was the future people needed. So we've been very, very lucky and we've learned a lot from those lessons. We realized I'm actually pretty ashamed actually of how we did things on the fallow deer project. But we're lucky that we've got the best ever curator, Rob Simmons, who was at university with me and has been very, very kind. And has said that he would rather that all of those samples were ground up in order to get the stories rather than being sitting in his archive. And the stories that we've got are that we have first generation fallow deer. We have a individual that has definitely been imported from France in terms of the rabbits. We've got essentially domestic farming of brown hares. We've got a very exotic looking cat, and the chickens. It's not published yet, and I don't want to blow the story, but it's amazing, right? We've essentially got a zoo. I mean, like a not very impressive zoo by our standards, but you know, those chickens, as I said, are really, really cool. So imagine in a world where you've never seen these animals before, now they suddenly land. This is mind-blowing stuff. And it gets even better because your colleague, Amy Bogart, you've probably seen that her paper has just come out. I mean, this is an old version of it, but I've just stolen some screen grabs of it, which is looking at social inequality across the world over, was it 40,000 sites? And then they're plotted by times. And the higher up you go on the Gini index, the more unequal your site is. So you can see that over here, we've got all of these sites. Can you see this one right up at the top? Yeah, it's Fishbourne. And just to give you some context, this one here, that's Knossos. So Fishbourne is ridiculous. And all of these independent lines of evidence are coming together to show that this is just the most fantastic site where we've got incredible things going on. But it doesn't last, because I want to show you what then happens once the Romans go away in Britain. Lots and lots of different species that we've been working on, and this just shows the zooarchaeological representation of them through time. What we then see is this. I think we're looking at quite a significant extinction event that is taking place, not just in Britain, but across the whole of Northern Europe for a lot of the species that are introduced during the Roman period. And I'm just going to pull it back to the fallow deer. This is what I showed you, that we have this map showing the representation and distribution of fallow deer in the Roman period. And you can see that those red ones are all up into Northern Europe. They go away. And we've got about 500 years where there are no fallow deer in Northern Europe, but it could just be that people weren't really hunting. There's no wild anything for about 500 years. But then when we do the genetic analysis and the fallow deer come back, it looks like this. So it's a total population replacement that we have happening from the fallow deer that were initially introduced. They go extinct and clearly extinct. They do survive down in the Mediterranean. So the Iberian deer that we have are descendants from Roman introductions, and the same is true with the Italian. But you can see even by the medieval and post-medieval period, those Balkans deer are almost gone, and they are now completely extinct. They probably die out around the 14th century. And we've got this second introduction that arrives this time from Turkey. Chris mentioned that I've done a lot of work on the Norman conquest. And what I always say is, it's definitely the Normans. The Normans came in and did it. Yeah, it's not the Normans. These arrived 1000 AD before the Norman conquest. And the more we're looking into the Norman conquest, it's got nothing. Yeah, it's already here. It's 1000 AD is the critical moment for everything happening. It's as it is on the continent. We've just got it into our heads that 1066 is really important. The rest of the world doesn't care, but we love it. But so, yeah, in terms of the fallow deer, it's not the Normans. They certainly popularized fallow deer for sure, because this is what happens. In the Doomsday Book, this is the number of parks So, because if you've gone to the effort of bringing a deer all the way over from Turkey, you're not just going to release it and go, be free, right? You're going to put it in a park. It's going to be yours. So we have this many parks, and you can see up at the top, it shows the representation of red deer and roe deer, both of which are native or were native before they also went extinct. And you can see that around the 11th to 12th century, fallow deer are the least well represented because they've just been recently introduced. Roll on a couple of hundred years, and you've got a rash of parks across the whole of Britain, and look at what happens to the fallow deer population. They are now actively being farmed in these new landscapes. Again, it's an exclusive kind of landscape that is very much linked with women. So we were talking about that connection between fallow deer and Artemis and Diana that continues into the medieval period. There's even really nice historic evidence that says we have these parks only for ladies to shoot the beasts that are there within them. So these fallow deer have always maintained this connection with women throughout time. What they bring with them, though, is not just the introduction of this new deer species. What we see arriving at approximately the same time are new hunting rituals. And this is from my thesis, and I stand by this as still being true. The historical record talks about when you've killed a deer in the medieval period, you don't just throw it on the back of your donkey and take it home. What you do is you roll it onto its back, you dig its antlers into the ground, then you split it from chin down to the testicles if it's a boy, whip the testicles and penis off, tie it onto a stick, parade it around, the dogs come in, they bark, there's blowing of horns, and then you butcher the animal in a very formulaic way. So first of all, you skin it so that you've got a blanket that you can do the butchery on. So you flay it down to the spine, and then different bits of the animal go to different people. They say that the left shoulder went to the forester or the parker as a fee for supporting the hunt. The right shoulder goes to the best hunter. The haunches go to the lords. The pelvis is left for the crow, and everybody gets a cut, even the dogs. And you'll have heard the saying to eat humble pie, right? That comes from the saying to eat numble pie, and numbles are the intestines, and you kind of bake them into a pie and give them. So everyone is getting a cut of this stuff. Now, when I first was reading about this, I was like, that sounds like nonsense. But of course, zoo archaeology can ground truth this, and it is true. So when we have a look at foresters and parkers' residences, we find only the shoulders, really, and they're always of the left-hand side. When we look at rural sites, we find, so villages, there's hardly any deer there, but when you find them, it's just the shoulder, always of the right-hand side. And when you go to elite sites, it's just those haunches. So these things, these rituals are happening. And when you bring your deer together, it shows that you've got a single individual that is being redistributed throughout society to create community in this period. So it's hierarchical, carcasses are hierarchical, and it doesn't matter how you cut them up. Someone gets a bit that will be perceived as better than others, but it's a bit of something within something. So you're receiving a meaty symbol of your social position. And I think that that's actually quite nice. We always imagine that hunting was just this elite thing done by posh people, but whole communities are involved. And I think that this is something that's important for us to think about for the reasons that I'm going to show you next, which is that, as with all fashions, this huge hunting culture that was everywhere in the medieval period goes out of fashion because fallow deer are too available. You can poach them. It's then a trickle down effect. So they're losing their social cachet. So everybody kind of gives up on hunting in general and putting deer in parks specifically. And the fallow deer escape, but they don't go away. And what these two maps show, so the one on the left shows all of the archaeological data, the representation of fallow deer across Britain, according to the sites that we have from 1000 when they're introduced to about 1750. These are the British Deer Society survey data, and you can see that that is an expanding population to the extent that they're now absolutely everywhere. And I love these deer, but even I can accept that they are becoming a bit of a problem. So the Department for DEFRA, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, leads with the statement, we need to do more to sustainably manage deer. The UK deer population is estimated to have increased from 450,000 in the 70s to 2 million today. They say they're now at their highest level for 1,000 years. That's nonsense, right? With the exception of the fallow deer, perhaps. But deer in general, they have no baseline for making that claim. It just sounds more scary if you say it's, highest levels for 1,000 years rather than highest levels since the 1970s, right? It just gives it gravitas. And I think it's important that we also check some of that. But in the case of fallow deer, it's true because fallow deer were only introduced 1,000 years ago. I'm not convinced that their populations are higher now than they were in the medieval period. They were probably about the same, but people aren't eating them anymore. And that's something that we need to think about too. So when I go and give these talks and I'm working with, the Forestry Commission and Natural England, the instant response to everyone that everyone comes up with, well, it's easy. I know how we solve this. We bring back the wolves. Rewild, bring back the wolves. And I was at a talk the other day with the wolf rewilding guys who are lovely. And I'm not saying don't bring back the wolves, but I think we just need to think about what's required. So Derek Gow, his book is brilliant. Hunt for the Shadow Wolf, the lost history of wolves in Britain, and then it gets really small, and the myths and stories that surround them, because that's all we have is myths and stories, right? In order to rewild anything, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature says that you need to know when a species went extinct and why, because if it's the same problem that you've got right now, why just bring things back so that you can have a load of dead wolves, right? So everybody looks to the historical evidence, which is, are there any historians in the room? Oh, I know there's one, which is my colleague. I'm so sorry. History's just lies. So it's just people telling myths and stories. But is there any actual evidence? And so this was a challenge that we gave ourselves. Well, historically, if you go to Ireland, you can't move because there are wolves everywhere. But actually, there's not really any evidence. So is that true in Britain as well? And the truth is that we can't find very much evidence for wolves. We've got Jess Peter, who's one of my students, and Lockie is he here? Okay, who's been working on this, and I don't want to present your results, but it's further back in time than the 1700s, right? Which is what a lot of people would suggest. So in the absence of this wolf story and in the absence of knowing when wolves went extinct, I don't think that we can. This is a line that I always find funny that no one else does. The idea that we bring back the wolves is an interesting concept, because the wolves that wanted to do the bidding of humans became dogs. And I don't know why we should expect wolves to be clearing up our problem. Like, maybe ask the dogs to go clean up this problem, but no one would want that because it's not as cool. So I think that all of this needs to be unpacked. But what I can tell you is the idea of bringing back the wolves to address the fallow deer issue is nonsense, because the wolves were already long dead, as were all of the other top predators, before humans introduced fallow deer. So that kind of like, oh, we need to rewild and bring this back doesn't make any sense. This is a human problem. We did it and we need to address it and take some responsibility. It was just like, this is the medieval equivalent of saying, like, thanks, boomer. It's these medieval people who've destroyed our lives, right? So we don't need to bring back the wolves. What we need to do is bring back the unmaking, right? Think about these animals as food for community rather than just a problem. So I did. I started schlepping complete deer carcasses into inner city schools at my last institution. And what we did was we got the children to follow the unmaking rituals, and we were trying to teach across the curriculum and serve up all of these issues in a palatable way, and get them to engage in food tech, healthy, cheap meals, deer management, all of these sorts of things. And they absolutely loved it. So even Megan kind of did get involved, and after going like, I'm not touching that, did get involved and helped with the butchery. All of them did. And then they converted the venison into healthy meals, brought in a celebrity chef, and brought in their parents, who of course are saying, like, I'm not eating venison. And it's like, what is venison? And they're like, I don't know. But everybody kind of realized that venison wasn't this scary thing, and that it was okay to eat venison. I'll just, for full disclosure, I'm a vegetarian, right? But I think, and so are quite a lot of people who are working with me on this project. But it seems like the right thing to be doing. And so we started then working with the National Trust. You have huge amounts of not only fallow deer, but red deer, and they are the landowners. And according to law, it's the landowners who own the deer. And if you catch them, then it's theirs. So they've got huge amounts of deer, and they are always really worried about how to present the fact that they have to cull the deer, because the public doesn't really like this, right? Or didn't really like it, but they were willing to do some unmaking, some public unmakings, which was really, really good. But then my project finished. The National Trust got reorganized, because everything gets reorganized, and we stopped doing all of this. And actually, without me, without them, is completely unsustainable. So we had to come up with something different. And that's the project that we're working on now, which is called Fair Game. And it's kind of accepting that there are huge problems. You can't just bring back a medieval system, because it was, it went out of fashion 300, 400, 500 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. So we now have a huge number of blockers and problems, but those deer are still here, and we've really got to manage them, because they are creating biodiversity problems. I think I said that populations have expanded. On the South Downs National Park Authority, they have carrying capacity for about 200 deer, no, sorry, about 20 deer per square kilometre, and they've got about 200 deer per square kilometre. And they can't plant enough trees before the deer just come and mow them all down. Triple SI sites are being downgraded. So this is an environmental stewardship concern, and the deer themselves are not healthy. So this is, for their own sake, for the population, we have to start looking after them. But there are blockers. So there aren't enough deer stalkers out there, because, and this came from one of the deer stalkers that I'm working with, who said, we are typically male, pale and stale. And the average age of a British deer stalker is about 65, and it's increasing year on year. There is nobody coming in, and they're like, what do we do? What do we do? And I think the answer, particularly in the case of the fallow deer, is let's try unlocking 50% of the population, which is women, because they've always been associated with fallow deer, and maybe we should do that. So that's something that we've been working on. But that's not the only blockers. There's just so much infrastructure problems. There's a lack of training. Trying to distribute this stuff is also a huge nightmare, because food standards, and you've got people going out and shooting things randomly. How do you ensure that the food standards are safe? We've then got, does anybody actually want to eat venison? Because if food standards aren't there, then, you've got, and also that whole ethical issue of, killing Bambi. So this project has been trying to address this whole thing. But that's where archaeology becomes really important, and the narrative that we have, because with all global challenges, they are cultural, they are not scientific. And so what archaeology brings is the heritage narrative that can make this understandable to everyone, and it seems to be working. So what we did as part of this project is we did a big wraparound comms thing. So we came up with a brand called Virtuous Venison. It's probably the only venison brand that doesn't feature a deer with antlers, right? Because we did a lot of workshopping of this, and no one, when you go and buy a burger, it doesn't generally have a picture of a nice smiling cow on it, right? Why do we feel the need to kind of attach deer and death together? I don't know. So we did this around the comms of why we need to have nature in balance. Hilary is an amazing food scientist, started going out to food festivals, doing tasters. Rob Simmons was there as well, so the curator from Fishbourne, he's on this project. We started a meat box scheme, working with a meat box group who already do beef, working with Virtuous Venison, and they were distributing everything. And we've got a little animated short, and all of the QR codes take you to that. But that's, it's good to get everyone accepting that venison is not this sort of awful, elite, horrible meat. If you're going to eat meat, it's the one to eat. But you've got to be able to provide that supply. And there isn't much infrastructure. So with, again, all of our partners, we've been able to install some new infrastructure, a game chiller down on the National Trust Slindon estate. And we started working with all of the food charities, not all of them, but two of them, Fair Share and Felix Project. So the deer that went into the game chiller, we were donating at least some of it to the Felix project, working again with our partners on the Sussex Wood project, which is Natural England. We supplied 10 tons of venison to the Felix project, which equates to about 24,000 meals for people who are in food poverty and really at the critical end of that. So I think there's a lot of good that we can do, but it takes the archaeology to be able to turn people's minds round in this. And the next steps that we're trying to do is actually unlock government procurement, because we have hospitals, we have schools, we have prisons, and at the moment they're importing a lot of frozen sheep meat, and really we should be providing this venison, because otherwise at the moment it's being shot to waste or it's being exported. And if you go to Waitrose to buy venison, it's been imported from New Zealand. So, you know, it's crazy. We need to be eating local venison. So we're going to do some work around that. And as a pilot, we're going to link the University of Exeter. We're going to get them to do a pilot putting venison, virtuous venison into their catered halls, and that will come from the National Trust, because we're trying to turn the National Trust round to start selling their own venison into their catering organisations, because they're a little bit nervous about that still, even though they did it in the past when we did our pilot before. So I'm going to use this now to go on this was our side quest. We're now going to go back to the fallow deer story where we left off, right? So we still have all of these like beautiful fallow deer populations, even though a lot of the parks have gone, and they're everywhere, like National Trust properties. They're represented. This is Petworth House, a painting by Turner that captures a fallow deer herd there. They're really part of what is considered to be a beautiful estate and a landscape. And that was something that was very well recognized by this guy, Codrington, right? You've got a statue of him in what library is it? That's it. So he's in the library, and he understood the beauty and the aesthetics of fallow deer on the estate. So when, as part of his colonialism, and went out to establish a sugar plantation, he took shed loads of fallow deer together with shiploads of African slaves to establish a game reserve on what was Barbuda. At the time, that wasn't part of the sugar plantation. And that is why fallow deer became part of the identity of the island. So there's lots of historical evidence that talks about the struggles between the Barbudans and the Codringtons. The Codringtons are just writing like, these Barbudans, they keep poaching all the deer. I can't believe it. And in the end, they're like, fine. And they emancipate the slaves, but they give them Barbuda. But it's like, this makes it sound like they're being generous. It's, you know, it's not a very, it's not agricultural land. But for that reason, you've got the Barbudans adopt fallow deer as their national animal. And today, fallow deer are such an important part of the Barbudan culture, economy. We have a lot of people who will go to Barbuda specifically to hunt some of the fallow deer. And then this is what then becomes really, really interesting to me. You will remember in 2016, the devastation of Hurricane Irma. This was happening just towards the end of the project. And what I found fascinating was that there was international assistance for pets and for livestock. The donkey sanctuary sent loads of people out to go and rescue all of the animals, all of the domestic animals that were out there. But no one, I was asking everyone, what's happening with the fallow deer? What's happening with the fallow deer? Is anybody, and no one cared, because there's no conservation, because they've been translocated, right? So the IUCN, there is no one cares about the Barbudan deer because they've been translocated. And everyone will be like, yeah, well, you know, it's dogs and cats are more important, but this is their national animal. And it bugs me that that is how it's being presented, because the Rhodes deer that have all of this international protection are also translocated. It's just that they managed to get translocated in the Neolithic. Therefore, it has this patina of age and authenticity, whereas in fact, the Barbudan deer were translocated in the 1800s together with the population. And I think what I want to say is that if you are translocated, whether you're an animal or you're a human, you are royally screwed, because the same has happened to the Barbudan population. No one came to rebuild other than the land grabs that came under the sort of environmental protection to rebuild and displace the Barbudans. So I think that there are things that there is sketchiness within our international conservation policy that we need to be a little bit alert to, because it's very easy to say things about animals without anyone going like, oh, that sounds a bit problematic. If you said any of this stuff about humans, it would be a lot more problematic. And actually, I suppose it is true that UNESCO does say similar things about humans, because they talk a lot about native and, again, translocated populations. Their heritage is less well represented than anything that is native. So the moral of this story, then, to some extent, is when we look back at how we think about the Barbudan deer, we're like, well, they've been translocated, that's fine. And yet they'll probably be grand, and they're considered to be a bit invasive. But the history of the fallow deer is a history of extinction. Like all of those populations that I told you about that were introduced earlier in the period, they're all extinct. In Britain, the deer went extinct. People are trying to rewild deer, but because no one's looking at the archaeological evidence, the kinds of animals that are being taken to different places are all the wrong animals. It depends whether you care about the genetics. That's another thing. I'm not totally sold that whether they're red ones or yellow ones matters. But if you do think that matters, you need to realize that all of the wrong ones are going to the wrong places. So this is something that we need to think about. And also, rather than seeing these animals as, the Deer Initiative, as it was, is presenting fallow deer as invasive and as a problem, they're endangered in that other area. So maybe we move some. So maybe translocation can be a good thing rather than a bad thing. Okay, so wrapping this up then. What I've tried to show in this talk is that, this is a really fascinating, just one species, and we can learn like 10,000 years of human history and attitudes to the natural world. We can learn about the spread of peoples and religions, shifts in landscape. So, the rise and fall of menageries and then parks. We can learn about hierarchy and community. So in Fishbourne, super hierarchical, but in the medieval period, we've got evidence of community coming through the redistribution of venison. We can learn about human impacts on and perceptions of biodiversity, whether it's seen as a good thing to have more animals, creating, greater biodiversity, or where those kind of attitudes shift. Similarly with food. So in some periods, venison is food and it's an important part of food. Today, it is not. So do we need to kind of use the past to bring back the most appropriate food systems and biodiversity systems that we have? As I said before, I think where archaeology is important is that we provide the context and the narrative to change people's minds in the present. And that's something that can only happen because of the archives that are available to us. I accept that I have destroyed quite a lot of those archives, but to try and make amends for that, we do, and this is me moving into a pitch, we do have, oh, poor Katrina's face is covered, but Katrina Mackenzie is PI on what is now called the Biocultural Hive. It's one of the, I'm sure everyone's heard about the Riches infrastructure money. She's won some of this to create the Biocultural Hive, which is heritage information in virtual environment. And the plan here is that before we start grinding up our specimens, we 3D scan them and make the models available up on the Biocultural Hive. And that every time we get results, they get linked back to that specimen, because that's where the richness comes, when you have a single specimen that's been analysed in lots and lots of different ways, and then you build that up into large sets of data. This is great. And then we can start making it all available. So perhaps we don't need to destroy quite as much biocultural heritage, and we've got records of it held in perpetuity, because we're going to be working with the ADS on this one. So if you have data, archaeological scientists here, consider not just taking a photograph with your phone, but getting something 3D scanned and donated into this. So, and then your results when they come into. So I will leave it there and say a big thank you to all of the people who've been helping with the Fallow Deer project, including the curation community, and everybody who's on the Fair Game project, including huge numbers of people within the deer community. So thank you.